Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Dang, I've gotta say, the new Tales from the Break Room coffee, Morning Brew, is my favorite coffee right now. Yes, this is a shameless self-promo, but it's genuinely good. Get yours before we run out at eeriecast.store. Join me, Morning Brew drinkers, as I have a very fun and scary episode today, full of state trooper horror, Japanese demons, and more. These are Tales from the Break Room. And don't forget to leave us a rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you haven't done so yet. Thanks. Mile Marker 22. From Motto Man. I work as a state trooper in a rural portion of a mountainous state. The job is generally quite boring. In rural areas, we get a lot of calls for service, for farm animals blocking roadways, crashes, and occasional lost children or senior citizens. Every once in a while, the boredom is halted by a moment of sheer terror. I work as an interdiction trooper, which really means that my primary responsibility is to intercept vehicles suspected to be of human or drug trafficking origin. A special set of tools I was equipped with consisted of night vision goggles and a drug dog, a yellow lab named Hutch. Hutch is not intimidating whatsoever, and is quite friendly. His job was only to sniff for narcotics. A lot of the job of an interdiction officer is spent in the median, just looking for unusual circumstances, namely out-of-state license plates, rental vehicles, stuff that is not normally seen in rural parts of the state. I was also issued a large Ford Expedition, which is a different patrol vehicle than most. It has more space for Hutch, and allows me to have access to extra gear and power tools needed to search vehicles. It was a particularly frigid winter evening, though snow had not yet fallen anywhere other than the mountains. As such, the skies were clear, and the roadways were dry. I was sitting in the median of the highway, when I noticed a set of headlights that appeared to be traveling at a high rate of speed. My radar gave off a reading of over 100 miles per hour on a 70-mile-per-hour highway. I turned on my overhead emergency lights, and the vehicle immediately began to slow. I caught up to the vehicle, a red Volkswagen, and it pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway. I turned on my takedown lights and my spotlight. I could see that the vehicle had 3 occupants. They appeared to all be college-aged females. I walked up, shining my flashlight into the mirror so that I couldn't be easily spotted. I spoke to the driver, who I noticed had just pulled her shirt down to be a little more revealing, a trick that some women attempt to get out of tickets. But in this case, it was not successful. All 3 women were friendly, overly friendly, something I found to be consistent with manipulative behavior. They were trying to be friendly to get me to let my guard down. I soon noticed the smell of alcohol coming from the vehicle, and I noticed that the driver's license of the driver indicated she was under the age of 21. I said, "Any reason you're driving so fast?" She answered, "We're out of school for the holiday. We're just trying to get home by a reasonable hour to be with our families." She did sound genuine. When I was about to respond by asking if she'd been drinking, I heard dispatch in my ear. "Any units in the area of mile marker 22 in the canyon? I have numerous 911 reports of a low-flying aircraft that may be crashing. I need units to respond code 3. I knew I was the only one working, and I would have been the only one in close proximity otherwise. I informed dispatch I'm clearing my stop and will be responding to the area. The girl was smiling, knowing she was about to get away with whatever illicit activity she was committing. "Thank you for your service," she said, as I walked away. The girls laughed. I ran to my car and started the siren. Then I headed towards the canyon, leaving the red Volkswagen behind me. I was still 20 minutes away from this call for service, even with my sirens on. As I entered the canyon, I remembered that I don't always have radio signal out here, due to these cliffs. It was guaranteed that I wouldn't have cell service, but the radio should work in most places away from cliff edges. I continued to run as quickly as I could in my school bus of a police car. At approximately mile marker 20, I attempted to pick up my radio to inform dispatch that I was in the area of the emergency, but I noticed that the radio didn't give any tones when I attempted to key up. I looked down and saw the screen fizzle out. I took out my handheld radio and found I couldn't even switch it on or off. It wasn't functioning at all. Hutch began to whimper and whine, which was not like him. He's used to lights and sirens and engine sounds. I could hear him shaking in his cage, which concerned me. At this point, I noticed that my stereo was only playing static. This was unusual, as I had downloaded this country playlist on my phone, so I wouldn't have needed cellular to listen to my music. I passed mile marker 22, and I slowed down. If this plane did crash, it should be in this area where the 911 calls stated they last had seen it. I summited a large hill, pine trees on either side of the roadway, making visibility a nightmare. Snow had begun to fall lightly as my elevation increased. As I crested the hill, I noticed the trees opened up to a large meadow. I turned on my spotlight and began using it to search the meadow for unusual activity. With my spotlight, I was able to locate the aircraft. It rested in the meadow with a large debris field surrounding it, and a clear path of destruction leading to it, as it had crashed into the trees and foliage and dug up the dirt as it went. My radio was still dead. At this point, my car engine died entirely. I pulled out my phone, trying to call dispatch directly. As I tried to dial, the keypad went haywire. It acted like someone was touching every button on the screen at the same time, which kept me from making the call. Then the screen went rainbow striped, and it shut down entirely. My traffic radar made strange noises I'd never heard before. Then there was a snap sound, and I noticed a little puff of smoke coming from the radar antenna. It was toast. I had no time for that. I ran back to my expedition and grabbed my medical bag. Then I began to run to the aircraft, which was about 300 feet off the roadway. As I was running to the craft, I noticed it didn't have any wings. Well, it had crashed after all, so maybe it lost its wings when it hit the trees. The craft was about twice as long as my expedition, but only about half as tall. I couldn't locate any engines. The thing was cigar-shaped. I ran up to it and began trying to find the occupants. Thing is, I couldn't find any windows or doors anywhere. I stood against the side of the craft, and I felt a slight warmth coming from it, but it made no noise. I found this strange writing on the side of the craft. Reminded me of hieroglyphics. I also noticed an insignia on the side that did not appear to be consistent with American military. Just then, the field was illuminated completely, and I was overwhelmed by the sound of a dual-rotor helicopter. I looked up, and I saw a Chinook helicopter orbiting the field, keeping the spotlight on the craft and myself. I was very concerned then. I'd responded to an airplane crash before, and it was nothing like this. I could hear Hutch barking from my vehicle. I noticed a lot of activity on the roadway. Several military trucks had just pulled up and surrounded my vehicle, and about 24 soldiers climbed out of those trucks. They had rifles slung, and 4 of them ran towards me, telling me to keep my hands away from my sidearm. The first one that reached me immediately took my sidearm out of my holster. The next grabbed my arm, telling me I needed to sit in my vehicle until I was told I could leave. I got a good look at the 4 men that were escorting me to my car. They wore military camo and had plate carrier vests with extra magazines. They had helmets on that also had night vision goggles equipped. Slung over the shoulder was an H&K MP7 submachine gun. They had no patches or insignia, aside from American flags on the front of their plate carriers. These definitely weren't some National Guard nerds. They opened my car door and made sure I sat down in the car. One stayed by the door of my car to make sure I didn't leave. I noticed the other soldiers were clearing the field and woodline around the craft. Then, a military semi-truck pulled up, which was pulling a large flatbed trailer with a crane. A second semi pulled up, and this one had a large military-style fifth-wheel camper trailer. It had what appeared to be a satellite relay on the top, and a large generator running in the back to power it. I assumed this was some sort of mobile command post. Hutch was going absolutely hysterical in the back. Behind me, I noticed the soldiers had set up a blockade on the highway. I then saw red and blue police lights near the blockade. How long had my radio not been functioning? If I had missed dispatch trying to check in on me, they likely sent other units looking for me to make sure I was alive, but I'd missed it. I attempted to use my radio then, but it still wasn't functioning. I watched in my mirror as a silhouette approached me, unmistakably a state trooper, campaign hat and all. It was my sergeant. For this guy to come out was unusual. You hardly ever saw him on the road. He said to me, "You okay, trooper?" I said, "Yeah, I'm good. Who are these guys?" He responded, "I was called about the downed craft, and I was told I needed to come and speak to you. Be here in case any media show up." Speak to me about what? Did I do something wrong? I don't think so, son, but I don't know who these guys are. It's best we just do what they say for now. This unsettled me. I'm not trying to get involved in anything. I just needed to check for casualties. That's why I was here. They took my gun, I told him. Sarge told me, "We'll get it back, but don't do anything hasty. This is all very strange. I've never seen any airplane like that before. It's shaped like a tic-tac. Where are the engines?" Just then, 2 men in suits approached us. They did not introduce themselves. I noticed they both were about a whole head taller than my Sarge, who was 6 feet. They both had Sig Sauer P226s holstered on their belts, with no visible badges. Their shoes looked neatly shined, and they made very uncomfortable eye contact with me. "What did you see?" I got the strong impression I wasn't supposed to have seen anything, so I replied, "Nothing, sir." One of them responded, "Good. All you saw here was a small passenger aircraft that had a malfunction." They turned to my sergeant, who looked unsettled. "Can you take his dash camera footage? We're gonna need it. Do not download it for your records." My dash camera had a storage device in the dash of my truck. You can only access it with a special key. He pulled out the key and inserted it into my dash, then pulled out the large storage component entirely, handing it over. One of the suited men opened the passenger door of my truck and took my body cam out. Then they both walked away. "What the hell is all this?" my Sarge asked. After about an hour, the craft was loaded onto the flatbed, covered by tarps. The helicopter was still orbiting. We were told to leave the canyon and to not follow the convoy, so we did as we were instructed. We drove back to the office in town where my LT stood waiting for us. "The hell happened? Why weren't you responding to the radio?" I explained. "It stopped working. No idea what happened to it." By then, my phone and stereo began to work again, and my handheld began working too. My radar, though, was absolutely fried. "What did you see?" he asked. My Sarge said, "Just a downed aircraft. We had bad radio signal up there. No casualties, though. Everyone went home safely." The LT asked the Sarge, "They just went home? I mean, don't we at least need to make a public statement?" The Sarge simply said, "No, that won't be necessary." The LT scratched his head. "What's wrong with you guys?" I went home at the end of my shift, and I had a lot of trouble sleeping. The next morning I was sitting in the kitchen, still ruminating on the night before. There was a knock on my door then. I opened the door, and there stood the two suited men from the night before. But I didn't see a car parked in my driveway, nor anywhere on the road. One of them handed me my sidearm, saying, "Thank you for your service. Remember what we told you." They then walked off my porch and down the sidewalk. I got the feeling that I shouldn't continue to watch them. When I got to work later that day, my dash camera storage unit was in my locker, along with my body cam. I plugged them both in. They'd been wiped clean. No records of anything that happened that evening after the traffic stop I made with that car full of drunk girls. The LT is back to pretending I don't exist. The worst part is I'm too afraid to tell anyone, because I just can't place it, but there's something unnerving about those suited men. I don't want to encounter them again. Banks of Mitoyo, from Salty Snowman. My name is irrelevant, but I'm 32 years old this year. I've been a travel vlogger for the better part of 12 years, so I go out, looking into haunted or abandoned places, often just doing what's called urban exploration. I've moved overseas since last year, and I made my way to what is now my home, in Kagawa, Japan. It had been a lifelong ambition to live in Japan, as I got lured in with their temples, rich history, and ancient ways of life. So I settled in the city of Mitoyo, which wasn't the largest city in Kagawa Prefecture, but honestly was quite beautiful and had its own way of life. It is a city rich in culture, legends, and lore. I was doing a vlog with a friend of mine. I'll call him T. T and I had been friends since I started doing my vlogs, and he stumbled across them all those years ago. He had emailed me with his excitement of seeing what the rest of the world had to offer, and we became fast friends. Honestly, as sweet as it is, we hadn't met up until last year, and that year was a whirlwind, perhaps the best year of my life. T and I planned a tour around Kagawa, of all its haunted and spooky locations. We'd already been to a few locations where nothing happened, but it was still pretty spooky. I enjoyed walking around the riverside, camping, looking for anything to vlog about, other than just walking and showing off the beauty of Kagawa. This day we were going to explore Yashima, which is a battlefield in Kagawa. It is also a lava field where people have lived for centuries. It seemed like a great place for ghost hunting, and honestly I'd been excitedly waiting all week for this. T and I made our way there, and we got set up within our claimed spot for the evening in the campground. It was still a ways till evening, but setting up meant we would be prepared for when it was time to set out and hunt. It was midday by the time we were done, so we took a rest for a few hours, until around 7. We got the camera, and we set up. It was a long process because somehow I had packed the batteries in the wrong bag, and it took forever to find the spare we needed. We had permission to go up to the temple, and I was thrilled to get started. So I figured, with that thrill, I'd mispacked some things. No big deal, but it was a massive time killer. T and I found the battery, and we were off on the trek to the temple. It wasn't too far, and we got there about 8 after we found a place to park and walked up the stairs. The hike was a lot of fun. We chatted about the history in front of the camera, explaining the temple's purpose and how it was still used pretty often during the day. We went on about how people reported seeing soldiers, priests, and other creatures, and how we hoped we would see something this night. The walk itself was gorgeous. They had the pathway lit up for the residents to show the fall leaves and the beauty of the shrine. It was open for everyone, even after the sun went down, due to the viewing season, but we had a section that was usually off limits for safety purposes. The power of waivers truly will never fail to impress me. T was getting a bit nervous. I couldn't tell if it was the excitement or the fear, but he was rambling about the history of the shrine itself, and how, when he was a child, he used to go here on his holiday breaks with his family. I was more so focused on the darkened spot that we were headed towards. It was a stark contrast to the well-lit areas. It seemed like the darkness was swallowing everything, even our own shadows, that were cast into the gloom. Things seemed to swirl, twirl, and melt into the void. The only thing I could see by was my camera's light. We were near an unused part of the shrine, and it was obvious it wasn't as tended to, since there were leaves littering the ground, a decaying holy rope around the tree. Granted, we were behind the shrine complex, but it was still a bit eerie, especially when I looked over my shoulder, seeing just how different the lit area was from where we stood. I heard rustling and turned my attention back towards the tree. In the branches I spotted a tanuki, which by itself really wasn't unusual. It was just a bigger version of a raccoon, really. It startled me, sure, but it was something pretty common in the area, so nothing unusual about it. And that moment had T chuckling, tossing acorns up at the raccoon to drive it away. Lovely, I thought. Just what I needed. Cursed by a temple raccoon. I rolled my eyes at T before chuckling under my breath. My friend was a child at heart, and I loved him for it. He could turn any scary situation into something to laugh at. I kept walking with T behind me until we reached a flat area out of sight of the temple lights, and we set up an extra camera, which was shooting in infrared, to see what our eyes couldn't. We began to ask questions into the air, waiting a few moments and playing the questions back on a recorder which we'd brought. And aside from what small sounds could be heard, we hadn't heard any words, just things that sounded like sighs or maybe small gasps, which could easily be dismissed as us exhaling or small gusts of wind that we couldn't feel at the time. I broke out our snacks and looked at the time. It was barely 10 at this point, so we had consumed quite a bit of time in that area. We moved on from the location, heading towards the battlefield instead, which was quite overgrown and took a long time to actually reach. It was midnight by the time we set up again. We then sat down for a break. We ran the recorder, seeing if we could get anything by just being quiet for a while. The cameras were running for the vlog, and I kept tossing a few jokes to T, who was getting a bit tired, if his yawning was anything to go by. We were a ways away from anyone at this point, even though we had seen a few teenagers doing a trial of courage on our way here. They were by this old building that they claimed was far more haunted by spirits than the old battlefield. I added that to our list of places to check out. But anyway, T and I were alone at this point. That's when we began to see shadows moving. It was out of the range of our lights, but I swore I'd seen shadows moving about in the dark. I was horrified seeing it. I didn't know what I expected, but shadow figures was definitely not it. They were flickering quite quickly. It was like I was seeing them through the snow of a TV. They were distorted, and everything about them seemed blurred, no longer of our world. They appeared more like projections onto our area. I wasn't even sure what I was seeing, but I heard T react with silent prayers as he pointed his own camera at the sight. He was trembling by now as he aimed the camera. I was standing on shaky legs, trying to get closer with the recorder in my hand. I heard nothing though. The figure simply rushed by, but replaying the recorder later, I heard screams, running, and what I guessed was bodies colliding. Honestly, the playback was far scarier than seeing the silent shadows. T followed me reluctantly, spewing forth prayers and noises of discomfort whenever a shadow got too close. I stopped when we reached a point of the field where we could no longer walk due to brambles. I had foolishly decided to wear shorts. But past the brambles, into the slightly overgrown part bordering a construction site, we saw more figures rushing towards us. These were tall, hulking figures that dashed out of the shadows. We ran then. We were absolutely booking it back to the car. When we reached it, the figures slammed into it, dispersing against the metal. But as they made their way through it, there was a rush of air and what sounded like angry, horrifying screams. We made our way back to the camp we set up. We went through our findings, and T refused to ever come back to that area again. And for once, I agreed. That Old Theater, from Indestructible. This happened when I was 17 years old. I'd been looking for a job, any job, but I didn't want to do the usual stuff. You know, fry cook, burger flipper, stuck in a loud kitchen with half your high school. A lot of my friends worked those places, but it just wasn't my style. I don't know. Fluorescent lights and greasy floors and yelling managers. It all felt wrong for me. So I tried looking online. I found a bunch of postings that went absolutely nowhere. I even showed up to one place, and the address wasn't even a business. It was an empty unit with paper on the windows. After a couple of weeks of that nonsense, I was about to surrender and put on a fast food hat when my neighbor told me he knew a guy who was hiring. He said it was hard labor, but the pay was good. And honestly, at that point, good money sounded like heaven. So I met up with the guy. I'll call him Mr. Danner. Mr. Danner told me he'd bought our town's old theater, the one that had been shut down for like 30 years. Everyone in town knew about it. Faded posters still stuck behind dusty glass, marquee lights long dead, that kind of thing. But apparently he had big plans. He'd bought the two businesses on either side of the theater and wanted to knock the walls down, adding extra screening rooms, making the old main theater the centerpiece, a huge one with a balcony and everything. He said nobody made theaters with balconies anymore, and he wanted something classic. So that summer, I started working for him. He stuck me on simple stuff at first, unbolting old seats, moving them out on these little dollies he had. We stripped out the whole place, molding, trim, dusty curtains, everything. The crown molding looked older than anybody working there. Crews were up on lifts, tearing down the big stuff, while I was just doing my thing on the ground. And truthfully, I didn't mind. I had my little tool bag he gave me, and it felt good just having a job where I didn't have to smell like fryer oil when I got home. After a couple of weeks, the main theater was completely gutted. They'd already cut a hallway and were building those new rooms on the sides. 4 new theaters in total. The heavy construction stuff was almost ready for the next team to come in. The carpet people and screen installers and the fancy seat company. That's when Mr. Danner moved me into the lobby. That place looked like a time capsule. There was an old popcorn machine with that greasy yellow glass and faded movie signs. There was some kind of metal roaster thing on the counter. I had to ask him what that was. He said they used to steam roast nuts in it, or candy or something. He said he wasn't even sure. Anyway, that's when things started to get weird. It started small. Some of the old glass cases were still on the walls back then, the ones that used to hold play posters. They had little bulbs lining the frames, like they were meant to light the posters up from all sides. Old school stuff. One afternoon, not even nighttime, just late in the day, they cut the power to the lobby. They were running new electrical lines, pulling out all the old wiring. Knob and tube, they called it. That was the day I learned what that even was. An electrician handed me one of those porcelain insulators and said, "Keep it, kid. You can sharpen a knife with it. They don't make these anymore." Not sure if he was serious, but I did keep it. Since the lobby power was cut, they had run extension cords everywhere. Lights strung across the stage and hanging off ladders, just enough to see what you're doing. I'd unbolted that old nut roasting machine a day or two before, and it was still sitting in the middle of the lobby. At the time, I thought it was just going to end up in the junk pile. But apparently, someone bought it. Whoever wanted that thing must have been really into the nostalgia. I was taking my break, sitting on what was left of the concession counter. They'd torn it out, dragging it into the middle of the room to haul later. I had my old sliding keyboard phone, playing some simple game on it. I didn't have a smartphone back then, just something to pass the time. And then, I heard this little hum, like a soft vroom. I looked up, and one of the display cases, the one still on the wall, was buzzing. A low, vibrating sound, and the bulbs were flickering. I remember thinking how weird that was. because there wasn't supposed to be any power in that whole section. Then, out of nowhere, it lit up. Bright. Too bright. Suddenly, a couple of the bulbs blew out with these sharp little pops. Glass specks pattered inside the case. It made me jump. It didn't make sense to me. How could that happen? A minute later, a few guys from another crew came in, asking if the machine in the lobby was the one that needed to be boxed up and sold. I told them yeah, that was the one. So they had me help move the counter and everything else out of their way. As we shoved the counter toward that same wall, I got a close look at the case that had lit up. The bulbs were pitch black inside, like smoke had filled them. They had definitely burnt out. After they wheeled the roaster out, I swept up the area. The old carpet had been glued to the concrete, and when they ripped it out, it left these little ridges everywhere, thousands of them. The owner told me they were going to diamond polish the concrete and buff it shiny later. But first, I had to get all this glue off. He gave me orange-scented glue remover. I mixed it up like the jug said, then I spread it across the floor, letting it sit for a while. But that while took forever. By the time I got to the last patch, the whole room smelled like those orange mechanic hand cleaners. I was kneeling there, looking at the floor, thinking it actually smelled kinda good. And that's when I heard it. A popping sound, just one at first, then another. Soft little cracks, almost cheerful. It took me a second, but when I realized what it reminded me of, I froze. Because it sounded like popcorn. But that couldn't be. The popcorn machine had been tossed in the dumpster 2 days ago. In fact, I unhooked the whole thing myself. Nobody had even touched that area since. I turned around, thinking maybe one of those poster case bulbs had blown again. But everything was still. Dead quiet. Except somewhere in that lobby, faint pop, 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 like a popcorn maker was warming up. That was enough for me. It was close to the end of my shift anyway, and I didn't want to be in there anymore. The orange cleaner said it was friendly and citrus fresh, but I treated it like it had a chemical smell, and I grabbed my stuff and got out. The next day, things were back to normal. Or as normal as they got in that place. A cleaning crew had come in earlier and scraped up all the glue I'd soaked. The concrete looked a little better, still rough but cleaner. I came in halfway through their shift to help haul out some trash and move boxes. Easy stuff. The kind of work where your brain starts to drift because all you're doing is lifting and sweeping. At one point, I walked through the lobby to toss some debris, and I caught a smell. I hadn't smelled this since the roaster had been pulled out, but I knew what it was. Roasted nuts. Warm, sweet, like I was right next to an old-timey festival booth or a mall kiosk. Cinnamon mixed with something else I couldn't place. Thing was, that roaster was long gone, sold, and the air in the lobby should have smelled like dust, wet concrete, that orange chemical stuff. But it didn't. Not then. It smelled like someone had just cracked open a fresh batch. I didn't say a word. I kept working, figuring maybe one of the guys had brought snacks or something. Later on, when we were pulling out another section of the old concession counter, the smell changed. It went from roasted nuts to something richer and thicker, reminding me of melted chocolate. Almost like those old theater treats dipped in chocolate. Things they hadn't sold here in decades. I remember stopping and sniffing the air, thinking one of the crew might have spilled something. But nobody had any food. It was all tools and dust masks, even warm Gatorade bottles. But no chocolate. A little while after that, the foreman asked me to go sweep the far corner again, the one near the old poster cases. That was my least favorite spot. I don't know why, I just didn't like being there. Anyway, I headed over, broom dragging behind me, and as I got close, I noticed something odd. The glass inside one of the cases was fogged over, just the inside, like someone had breathed on it, and there was a little smear on the lower corner. Maybe it was a handprint, except it was too smudged to be sure. I hoped one of the guys had brushed by it earlier, but again, no one ever went near those things unless they were taking one down. I turned away and kept sweeping. Dust, concrete grit, little shreds of glue, nothing special. But then, quietly, just on the edge of my hearing, I heard something. It wasn't a pop or a hum. It sounded more like people. They weren't talking. It was more like a crowd settling in before a show starts. The soft shifting of people's bodies, an occasional whisper, the low murmur of an audience waiting. It drifted through the lobby, like it was coming from the old theater hall itself, like the seats we'd torn out were still full. I stood there with my broom, holding my breath, listening. The murmur faded, then came back, but then faded again. There were no clear words or footsteps, just strange, quiet sounds of a crowd that should not have been and was not there. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the empty hallway. And when I finally stepped outside into the daylight, it was like someone turned the silence back on. Nothing followed me out. Nothing echoed after I closed the door. But I swear, it felt like I'd walked out of a room full of people. After that day, a few more strange things happened. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could really point to, just little things. An occasional smell that shouldn't be there, a flicker of light even with the power off, the sound of shuffling in a room that was completely vacant. But the odd thing was, the more we tore out, the quieter everything got. Like every strip of carpet, every row of seats, every chunk of old molding we pried loose, took something with it. By the time we pulled down the balcony railings and scraped the last of the glue off the concrete, the theater wasn't doing anything anymore. I stopped hearing hums and whispers, and I stopped smelling things. It was like we'd gutted whatever life it had left, like we'd torn its very soul out. When the renovation was finished and the place finally reopened, none of the new crew ever mentioned anything weird. The place was all bright lights and new carpet and fresh paint. It was just another movie theater now. But for me, that summer will always stick with me. I'll never forget those eerie little things. It felt like the old theater was trying to hold on, trying to put up a fight, trying to save itself from being torn apart. I'm not sure if you believe in that sort of thing, but I was there, and I'll never forget it. The Plaster Man, from Billy Towers. I'm a construction worker, or rather, a deconstruction worker. I work in demolitions, and despite what many people think, it's not just slamming a wrecking ball into a building or blowing it up from the base. Demolition requires planning, including learning the integral structure of a building, identifying potential hazardous materials, determining the most suitable technique for the job, and of course, ensuring that absolutely no one is in the building. Clearing out vagrants is the most challenging part of this job, at least for me. Living in the Midwest, most of them are just homeless people trying to get out of the cold, with the occasional user trying to snort, smoke, or shoot up in peace. Whatever the case, it doesn't feel great telling someone who was once peacefully asleep that they now have to clear out, or risk getting blown sky high or buried under rubble. That's how I used to feel, until I got the plaster factory job. This happened bright and early at 6 in the morning. Well, bright is an overstatement, because the sun wouldn't rise for another hour and a half, but it happened in the morning. My work crew and I gathered around the plaster factory, a run-down construction material plant that hadn't been used in over 40 years. It was anyone's guess how it was still standing, but it was. and now it was our job to tear it down that day. Initial sweeps of the building showed no signs of anyone staying there, but despite this, I could not shake the feeling that every time I entered the place, I felt like I wasn't alone, like I was being watched. I also swore I heard breathing, short, raspy breaths that barely registered above a whisper. My coworkers explained it away. Sometimes the foundation shifts, and when the foundation shifts, it makes noises, they said. I guess that just comes with old creepy buildings, which is why I was glad to see it being torn down. Our site manager gave us our assignments, and I, of course, and 3 other poor souls, were chosen to do one last sweep before the charges were finally set. When we walked into the building, the feeling of being watched immediately came over me again, like the walls themselves had eyes. I was ready to leave before we even started. 2 of the 3 went off to the east, and the last and I went off to the west to perform a full sweep. My coworker, whom I learned is named Josh, went up a narrow staircase and found ourselves in the old office area of the plant. We looked under desks, in cabinets, and in closets, and came up empty. Nothing but old files and cans of plaster. Just as we were about to leave, Josh turned to a nearby wall and stared at it. When I asked him what was wrong, he said that he felt the wall was looking at him. That alone had me ready to walk out, to get everyone in here and have the place stripped down to the studs. Quick narrator's note, I had to switch microphones because that one was giving me problems, so it might sound a little different here on out. He slowly inched closer to the wall, watching for the debris on the floor until he was right next to it. His radio buzzed. Then it spoke with the voice of our site manager, asking for our location. I turned to the wall, only to see 2 eyes open from the wall, staring at Josh. Josh looked up and screamed as a mouth formed from the wall, and it screamed in response. Soon 2 legs loosened themselves from the wall, along with a torso and 2 arms, one of the hands holding a hammer. He was completely naked, which is how I knew they were a he. Every part of his body had been covered in plaster. I stood in stunned silence as the man covered in plaster raised his hammer at Josh, who was now screaming and backing away frantically. This plaster man swung his hammer down on Josh's head, cracking his skull and dropping Josh to the floor limp. The plaster man turned to me with a plaster-covered face and yelled for me to get out. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned around and immediately went for the hallway. Just as I'd made it to the top of the stairs, I heard the sound of something shaking, maybe something cracking. I turned around quickly to see the plaster man crash through the drywall of the office rooms into the hallway. I stared, frozen in fear, as I watched blood trickle down the plaster man's face. His right shoulder was limp, dangling loosely. I think he dislocated it when he rammed through the wall. He grabbed his arm with his left hand and popped his shoulder back in with a growl. He screamed again, this time at both a high pitch and a low tone, for me to get out. I stumbled backward and found myself falling down the stairs. I tumbled and tossed on each step before I hit the landing. I groaned before I picked myself up to see the plaster man dashing down the stairs after me. I turned and ran back to the main entrance, the plaster man close on my heels. I opened the main door and ran out, stopping to catch my breath when I thought I was far enough away. I turned, and there was the plaster man at the threshold of the door, panting as he glared at me. It didn't take much convincing to get the site manager to call the proper authorities. After a violent but brief encounter, they were able to apprehend the plaster man and get Josh to safety. Josh suffered a concussion and had to get 37 stitches. Plaster man was also sent to the hospital, but I'm not really sure what happened to him after that. What I do know is that the next time I check for people in a building, I'm not taking just one person. and I'll definitely be taking closer looks at the walls. Uber Legend from B.W. Newman. Some time ago, I was listening to another of the podcasts on this network about skinwalkers and how they seem to be adapting, manipulating technology. It slotted a lot of pieces into place for me about an incident that occurred a few years ago when I was driving for Uber. This isn't one of those tales of a lonely stretch of road and something nefarious keeping pace with my car, but it might be something just as embedded in our collective paranormal experiences. A phantom hitchhiker. Only she wasn't a hitchhiker. A phantom, maybe. Likely, but not a hitchhiker. Not really. Like I said, I'd been driving for Uber. I accepted this ride. There were account details and everything. Both locations were real. Granted, the pickup location was a bit strange, but nothing hair-raising. The spot had been recently raised for a box store bonanza. You know the type, like a strip mall only on Texan-sized steroids. The area used to be one of those post-war neighborhoods, small family homes built for returning GIs and their future progeny. I mean, all that PTSD concentrated into one geographic area. Who knows? Maybe something took root, frayed the edges of that liminal veil. More likely, the economy took a dip. The rich ditched, and just as the place was about to slip into official urban decay, a developer came in to save the day. Poetic, no? Anyway, when the call came in, those houses had been rubble for a long while, and you could just make out the shadowy shapes of heavy machinery on the outskirts of the property. In short, this was not an ideal place for adolescent antics, but given that it wasn't far from a commercial/residential area, it wasn't the oddest place to request a ride from either. It was quiet and secluded, but also very well lit. It had been a Goldilocks kind of night. Not too slow, not too harried. A balanced smattering of talkers and window gazers. But now I was ready to go home. So when the app offered me one more ride, I nearly declined. But I noticed her destination was in the same direction as my place. So I figured one more ride couldn't hurt. I envisioned a quick drop-off at one of the fancy condos I assumed she lived at, then heading home to close the night off with a much-deserved nightcap. When I pulled up, she opened the door and closed it again. There was no walking through walls nonsense, or 1 second she's outside and the next she's sitting in the back seat, staring creepily at me through the rearview mirror. There were no overt red flags. At least, nothing I could clock at the time. Looking back, one could argue there were a few key moments, seasoned with a little spooky spice, but nothing that a dose of rationale couldn't clear up. For example, this had been a cool but dry spring night. The weather had not been calling for rain, and yet this girl was soggy. Not like fell into a pool kind of wet, more like she took a few sprints through the community sprinkler system. I didn't really think too much about it. We were all young once. We've gotten up to all manner of ridiculous mischief once or twice. Frankly, I was more concerned about my back seat than this girl's watery escapades. I could tell right away she was going to be a window gazer, which suited me just fine. I just wanted to get us both home as quickly as the laws allowed. She was profoundly quiet. I kept peeking into the rearview mirror to make sure she was still alive, which in hindsight was grossly unnecessary. I thought about making small talk or turning the radio on, but there was something sanctified about this silence. It was the sort of quiet that envelops a gravesite. For her part, she just kept looking out the window. Then I noticed she wasn't holding her cell phone. I haven't seen many teens without a Heston vice grip on their devices. Maybe the battery was dead, or it got waterlogged after her misadventures. Who knows? At the time, it was one of those passing observations that did not warrant much thought. But when you zoomed out the picture, things got a bit more perplexing. One thing I forgot to mention was her outfit. Aside from being damp, it was outdated. When I was pulling up, I was taken back a couple of decades by the faded jean combo she was rocking. A jean jacket over a garish t-shirt, sporting some long-forgotten 80s pop icon, tapered acid-washed jeans, leg warmers, and Reeboks. Her hair seemed to be coming down a bit after having been teased to within an inch of its life. She had most of it tied up with a neon green scrunchie. Everything had a plausible explanation. I'd picked up a Stranger Things superfan making her way back home from some cosplay pool party gone awry, and now all she wanted was to go home and sleep it off. I didn't pull up to any condos like I thought I might. Instead, I drove down a dark cul-de-sac and up what I assumed was her driveway. That's when it all sort of fell apart. I didn't hear the door open, and the interior lights had been acting up so they didn't come on. But by the time I stopped and looked back, she was gone. The only indication that she had been there at all was my damp back seat and the wide-open car door. At first, I was annoyed. No thanks or sorry for the upholstery, but now you can't even close my door. I looked around, but I couldn't see her. So then I got worried. Did she fall out at some point? Was she sick and splayed out on the driveway? I came around to her side of the car, but she wasn't there. She wasn't anywhere. The house I'd pulled up to was dark, and it stayed dark. The street remained deserted. I mean, it's possible she ducked and rolled before I pulled into the driveway, but then what? She sprinted into someone's backyard and jumped the fence to avoid detection? The fare was prepaid, so it's not like she was skipping out on the bill. It was weird, uncanny. And before y'all ask, no, I didn't talk to anybody at the house. There was no grieving mother smiling sadly at me with a framed photo of the daughter she lost 20 years ago. There was just me, looking increasingly more and more suspicious, prowling around some random person's driveway. I shut the door and I made my way back behind the wheel. I was super tired by this point, and more than a little weirded out. So I didn't even check my Uber app. I just clocked out and went home. It wasn't until the next day, when I was going through my rides, I noticed hers was missing. Like it had never taken place, it had never been there. But I know it had been. I drove to 2 separate locations, I had a passenger, and the wet seats proved it. Of course, I inquired with Uber, but they came back with nothing. They had me signing out of the app right before I confirmed the last ride. I've never been quite able to get my head around this. I have no idea who that girl was. I had no reason to remember her name. Sure, I confirmed it at the time. It was something like Cassie or Chloe, but nothing to build an internet sleuthing ring around. I was just going to file this one under stories for the bar when I heard that Skinwalker episode, and my worldview imploded a little. Somewhere out there, I think there's a ghost in the machine, just trying to make her way home. The Mad Ill Lot. From Anonymous. People have this romantic idea about the starving artist, the tortured genius in his garret, suffering beautifully for his craft. Nobody tells you the Garrett is actually a 2003 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and a passenger seat full of everything you own. I ended up in Oklahoma by accident, more or less. I'd been heading to Austin. I had a friend there who said I could crash on his couch while I figured things out. But the Civic had other plans. The transmission started to slip somewhere around Ardmore, and by the time I limped into this nothing town called Madill, the mechanic told me I'd be lucky to get another 50 miles before it gave out completely. I could still drive it around town if I babied it, but the highway to Austin might as well have been the moon. $2,200 to fix, I was told. I had about $400 to my name, so that was that. My car was a ticking disaster. Madill, Oklahoma. Population maybe 4,000. 1 Walmart, 1 McDonald's, A Mexican restaurant that was actually pretty good. I ate there once before I started rationing what was left in my bank account. After that, it was gas station food and whatever I could find at the food bank at the Baptist church on Wednesdays. I parked behind the Walmart at first, which was stupid. They ran me off the second night. After that, I found this spot, a dirt lot behind a farm store that closed at 5. The owner was this older guy named Dean, who saw me pulling in one evening and came out to see what I was doing. I told him the truth, that my car broke down and I was waiting on money to come in. I just needed somewhere to sleep. He said I could stay as long as I wasn't doing drugs or causing trouble. I wasn't, so yeah. 3 weeks I lived in that lot. As for the writing thing, I should explain that. I'd sold exactly one short story in my entire life. $800 to a literary magazine no one's ever heard of. But in my head, I was a writer. I was going to write the great American novel. I was going to be somebody. Instead, I was 34 years old, sleeping in my car in Oklahoma, applying to gas station jobs on my phone, and getting rejected by most of them. And then, the thing started to show up. It was around the end of my second week there. The first encounter, I thought it was a dog. A big one, maybe some stray. The lot backed up against this empty field, and beyond that was woods. Decent-sized patch of timber that ran along some creek. I'd see deer sometimes in the early mornings, coming out to graze in the field. Dogs weren't unusual either in a rural area like this. People just let their dogs run about. But this wasn't moving like a dog. I was trying to sleep. It was maybe 2 in the morning, hot as heck, even with the windows cracked, and I kept hearing this sound, a sniffing sound like a pig rummaging around, a grunt and a huff. I sat up and looked out the back window. There was this shape out in the field. It was about 50 feet from the car. It was down on all fours, nose to the ground, working its way across the grass in strange little circles. The moon was bright enough that I could see it pretty well, and my first thought was, that's a big freaking pig. My second thought was, oh, that's not a pig. The back legs were longer than the front, so it moved with this weird rocking motion, hindquarters higher than the shoulders. The snout was long, more like an anteater than a pig, and it swept left and right as it probed the ground in front of it. I don't know how long I watched it, but eventually it moved off toward the tree line and disappeared into the woods. That was a rough night for sleep, I'll tell you that. The night after, it was closer. Around the same time, the same sounds. But this time, when I looked out, it was only about 20 feet from the car. It was still snuffling around in those strange circles. But I could see more details now. The skin was hairless, or mostly hairless. Patches of bristle here and there like a diseased hog. The color was disgusting. Like gray pale with a sheen to it. I mean wet looking. It stopped what it was doing and raised its head. The snout came up and waved in my direction, like it was tasting or smelling the air. I could see its nostrils flare up, 2 dark slits at the end of that long tube. It didn't have eyes, or I couldn't see them. If it did have eyes, they were small enough to disappear in the moonlight. We stayed like that for 10 seconds. I was in the car trying not to breathe, and that thing was in the field, snout pointed at me like some sort of dreadful antenna. Thank God it went back to rooting around rather than taking notice of me. I got out of there, started the car, transmission grinding and engine whining. The whole vehicle shook like it was going to fall apart, and I drove carefully to the Walmart parking lot. Security or whatever be darned. I sat in that lit parking space until dawn, and I didn't close my eyes once. Dean asked me the next day why I'd moved. I told him there was some animal out there that was freaking me out, some sort of wild pig thing. He gave me this look, and he didn't look surprised. "Did you see which way it went?" Into the woods, towards the creek." "Yeah, folks have seen that before, or something like it." He didn't elaborate. Fine by me, I guess. I went back to that lot that night, because I didn't have anywhere else to go. The Walmart security guy had already warned me twice, and at least Dean's lot was safe from cops. That thing came back around 2:30. I was awake because I was waiting for it, watching. This time it came right up to the car. I could hear it breathing through my cracked window. There was this scraping sound too, against the driver's side door. I saw it standing on its back legs now. Its front legs looked more like arms, and they were braced against the window frame. The thing's snout was pressed against the glass, leaving a smear of something thick and yellowish. I didn't see a mouth, though. Again, just a long snout and two nostril slits, opening and closing only inches from my face. It huffed against the glass, fogging it up, and made this sound in its throat, like a gurgling noise. Imagine holding your head underwater and trying to make a growling sound. I'm not sure why I didn't scream. God knows I wanted to. But I was in this frozen state. Reminded me of those nightmares I've had, where you can't scream or move even though you so desperately want to. But it was real life. I sat there watching this thing investigate my window like it was trying to figure out how to get in. After a couple of minutes, it dropped back down to all fours and moved off. I watched it cross the field until it vanished into the trees. My transmission money came through 3 days later. A tax return that I wasn't sure if I was even going to get. It was direct deposited into my account, and I felt like a miracle had happened. I was at the mechanic shop before they opened, and I was luckily out of Madill by noon. I didn't even say goodbye to Dean, which I still feel guilty about because he had been so good to me. That was about 8 months back. I'm in Austin now on my friend's couch like I planned, and I still haven't found a real job. I'm doing DoorDash now, and it's enough to keep me off the streets. I haven't tried to write anything since I left Oklahoma. One time I tried to Google Madill, Oklahoma, strange animal sightings, or Oklahoma pig creature, or variations of that, but I still haven't found anything like what I saw. Halloween Visitors, from Anonymous. We don't get trick-or-treaters because our house is 3 miles off the main road, down a gravel drive that doesn't even show up on most GPS apps. Our nearest neighbor, the Perezes, they're a solid mile through the woods. Their kids are grown anyway, both moved off years ago. So, when I heard knocks on Halloween night, my first thought wasn't, oh, trick-or-treaters. My first thought was something is wrong. My mom has been bedridden going on 2 years. A stroke took most of her left side, and what it didn't take, the diabetes has been working on since. I moved back home to help when it became clear she could not manage on her own anymore. I'd been living in Shreveport. I had a decent job at a dental office there. That was right after my 28th birthday. I'm 30 now. 2 years of feeding tubes and bedpans and physical therapy, and yet all of it hasn't really done much of anything. I've cooked her meals for 2 years now, but she can barely swallow, and we're both just pretending that we don't know how this ends. The house is my grandmother's originally. She left it to my mama when she passed. It's pretty old and sits on about 40 acres of East Texas pine woods. My granddad bought it cheap back in the 70s, and nobody ever did anything with it. There's no cell service unless you walk up to the ridge behind the old barn. The internet comes through a hotspot that I pay too much for. We get water from a well and power from lines, which go down every time the wind picks up. Halloween isn't a thing out here. Never has been. When I was little, we would drive into town for trick-or-treating, hit the neighborhoods by the school. Out here, there's nothing but trees and dark. So when I heard that knock, 3 raps, polite sounding, spaced out, like someone had been taught proper manners, I got up from the couch really slow. Mama was asleep in her hospital bed in the back room, oxygen machine humming like it always does. I didn't turn on the porch light right away. I just went to the window by the door and looked out. There were 3 children on my porch, 2 boys and a girl. They looked to be around 8 or 9 years old. They were wearing costumes. One of the boys had a vampire cape, the other was dressed like a cowboy, and the girl was a witch with a pointy hat. They had plastic pumpkin buckets for candy. I just stood there, trying to figure out how they even got here. No car in the driveway, no headlights on the road. The closest neighbor is a mile away through thick woods, and it was already full dark. Maybe 7:30. No kid is walking 3 miles down an unlit gravel road on Halloween night, even if their parents allowed it. Nobody even knows this house is out here. They knocked again. The same 3 polite raps. I should have just not answered. That's what I tell myself now. I should have turned off the lights and gone back to checking on Mama, and let them knock until they gave up. But they were kids, or they looked like kids, and it was a cold night, getting down near 40 degrees. I couldn't just leave children standing on my porch in the cold. I turned on the porch light, and I opened the door. "Trick or treat," they said, all 3 of them at the same time. Not like kids do it, all jumbled up and out of sync. They said it together, almost rehearsed sounding, even in the same tone. The vampire boy was closest to me. He smiled, and the smile was normal, but his face didn't move the way faces move when people smile. The mouth went up at the corners, the teeth showed, but nothing else lifted. His eyes stayed exactly the same, like watching someone do a smile that they'd only seen in pictures. I looked past them, scanning the driveway, the tree line. "Where are your parents?" "They're waiting," the girl said. She pointed back toward the road. But there was nothing out there, just dark and trees. "I don't have any candy for you," I said, which was true. Why would I buy Halloween candy? "I'm sorry, we don't really get visitors out here. I wasn't expecting anyone." "That's okay," said the cowboy. His voice was like the others, with the same cadence. "Can we come inside and wait? It's so cold." "Wait for what?" "For our parents." The porch light was right above them, and I could see them clearly now, and I was starting to notice things. Their costumes didn't look cheap or homemade, but very, very old. The vampire cape had stiff, shiny fabric, which I don't think they made anymore. The cowboy's hat was shaped like something from a western that I'd watched with my granddad. The witch outfit had a collar I remembered from a costume catalog we used to get when I was little, back in the 90s. And their faces, the more I looked, the less they looked like anything. I know that doesn't make much sense. It's like when you stare at a word too long and it stops being a word. Their features were all there, I could see that. Their eyes and noses and mouths, everything in the right place. But there was no life behind any of it. It was like I was looking at and talking to cardboard cutouts. "I'm sorry, I can't let you inside. My mama's sick. She's sleeping." "We'll be quiet," the vampire said. "We just need to come inside and wait." They still hadn't blinked, not one of them. I'd been standing there at least 2 minutes by then, and not one of them had blinked a single time. "You need to go back to your parents." I began to close the door. "I'm sorry, I can't help you." The girl tilted her head. much too far, like her neck had a hinge on it, and she held it there at that angle. "We can hear her breathing," she said. "The sick one. Her lungs sound wet." I slammed that freaking door, locked it, and deadbolted it too. I stood there with my back against it, and my heart going crazy. I listened. I didn't hear anything, no footsteps down the porch and no little voices. After maybe 30 seconds, I made myself look out the window again, but the porch was empty. No kids, no pumpkin buckets. I looked out at the driveway and the yard and the tree line too, to be sure, but there was no movement anywhere. I sat up in Mama's room until morning with every light in the house on. I was watching her breathe. Her lungs did sound wet though. They sounded wet for months. The hospice nurse had said we needed to talk about options soon. But I'd been putting off that conversation. Around 3 in the morning, I got up to use the bathroom. The window in that room faces the backyard, towards the tree line, and I don't know why, but I looked out. 3 shapes at the edge of the woods, kid-sized, standing perfectly still in a row. They were facing the house. I didn't look out another window until the sun came up. By then, the yard was empty. Again, no footprints or marks on the porch, no proof that I'd had any visitors at all. I called the Perez's the next afternoon when I could get signal. I asked Maria if she'd seen any kids around, anyone new in the area. She laughed and said, "Honey, there hasn't been a child on this road since our youngest graduated high school in 2013. I told her about the 3 kids on my porch, and she went quiet for a second, then said I must have been dreaming, that stress will do that to you. She told me taking care of your mama all alone out there must be hard. Whatever. Well, my mama passed 3 weeks later. Pneumonia finally took her. I was holding her hand when it happened. The house is mine now legally, 40 acres of that East Texas pine. I've been thinking about selling. A developer came by last spring asking about the land, and he left his card on the porch. I keep picking it up, telling myself to call. But every time I get close to doing it, I think about those 3 kids standing at the tree line, waiting. And I think about whoever buys this place, moving in, not knowing what happened here. So the card stays on the counter, and I stay in this house. Job Shadow Day. From The One They Call Lewis. My school does Career Shadow Day every year, and if you don't know what that is, you're supposed to follow someone around at their job for a morning. Most kids shadow their parents, but my mom works from home doing medical billing, and my dad drives trucks long haul. So neither of those were options for me. However, my best friend Cody said I could shadow his dad. He's a pastor at a Baptist church over on the west side of town. I figured that would be easy points. Just sit in an office, maybe help set up some chairs. Done by lunch. Cody warned me it would be boring. He was right about that part, at least. Pastor William picked me up from school around 8 and drove us over to the church. It was a big brick building, probably built in the 60s or 70s. It had a tall white steeple and those windows with the colored glass that aren't quite stained glass but want to be. The parking lot was almost empty except for 2 other cars. Wednesday mornings aren't exactly prime church time. Inside, the place was dim and cold. They keep the heat low during the week to save money. This was something that Pastor William explained. He introduced me to Mrs. Hannigan, the church secretary, and Miss Darlene, who runs the Sunday school program. Both of them were nice enough, but clearly had their own stuff to do. So after the introductions, Pastor William took me on a tour of the building. The main sanctuary was huge and completely dark, except for some light coming through those colored windows. All the pews were empty. The pulpit up front had a big wooden cross on the wall behind it. Our footsteps echoed off the ceiling. Pastor William was telling me about how many people they get on Sundays and what his sermon prep process looks like. But I was mostly just looking around at how different a church feels when nobody's in it. All that empty space meant for people, but no people inside, except for a few. It was all silence and dust floating about in colored light. We went through some classrooms, a kitchen, a fellowship hall with folding tables stacked against the wall. Then Pastor Williams said he needed to check on something in the storage area downstairs, and I could wait in his office or come with him. So I said I'd come with him, because sitting in an office sounded even more boring than just following him around. The stairs to the basement were behind a door near the back of the sanctuary. The stairwell had a light switch at the top, but when Pastor William flipped it, nothing happened. He said the bulb must have burned out again and pulled out his phone to use as a flashlight. I did the same with mine. The stairs were concrete, narrow, and cold. The basement was this long hallway with doors on either side, most of them open to dark rooms full of old furniture and boxes. Christmas decorations, folding chairs, that kind of stuff. Pastor William went into one of the rooms at the far end of the hall to look for something, told me to wait in the hallway, and I stood there with my phone light pointed at the floor. I don't know how long he was in there. A few minutes, I guess, but I was already starting to get bored and wandered a bit down the hall, looking into the other rooms. One of them had old choir robes hanging on a rack. Another had a bunch of those felt boards they use for kids' Bible lessons, the kind with little felt cutouts of Jesus and sheep and stuff. When I turned around to walk back, I couldn't see Pastor William's phone light in the room anymore, so I called out to him. My voice sounded so weird in that basement, kind of flat and echoey at the same time. There was no answer, so I walked down to the room he'd gone into and shone my light inside. But in there it was just boxes and an old piano covered with a sheet. He wasn't in there. I figured he must have gone back upstairs when I wasn't paying attention. Maybe he said something and I hadn't heard him. So I walked back down the hallway towards the stairs. That's when I saw him standing at the other end. He was at the very end of the basement hallway, where I hadn't yet walked. There was another door down there that I hadn't noticed yet, and he was standing in front of it, with his back to me. He wasn't using his phone light anymore. He was just standing there in the shadows. I called his name again. He didn't turn around. But he did raise one hand, gesturing for me to come towards him. Like a little wave, very slow. Come here. Something about it made me not want to move at all. The way he was standing, that could have been it. Very still, like he was waiting for something. And his arm, when he waved, it moved kinda strange. Smooth, like it was dangling upside down, not like a man with muscles and bones in his arm. And he still had not turned around. I called again, asking if everything was okay, but he didn't answer. He simply waved again. I took a couple steps back instead. But when I moved, Pastor Williams moved. He turned his head to look at me over his shoulder. He only turned it part way, just enough that I could see the side of his face in my phone light. Pastor William has a beard. A short one that's mostly gray. But the face I was looking at had no beard. It did have a chin that was too long and too flat. I ran. I was going up the stairs 2 at a time. I slammed through the door at the top and came out into the sanctuary, where there was Pastor William standing by the pulpit, talking to Miss Darlene. He looked over at me when I came crashing through the door. Both of them did. He asked if I was okay and where I'd been. He said I looked pale. I told him I got turned around in the basement, and it freaked me out. He laughed, then straightened up, telling me not to go anywhere in the church without being accompanied. And I looked at him, confused. What was he talking about? He was the one that led me to the basement, after all. Before I could utter a word, he went back to talking to Miss Darlene. So I decided not to say anything about what I saw. I told Cody later that night, but Cody just said I was messing with him and got annoyed with me when I said it really happened. So I just stopped bringing it up after that. The Career Shadow Day report I turned in said I learned about sermon preparation and church administration. I got a B+. I haven't gone back to that church. Cody still goes every Sunday with his family like he always does. I asked him from time to time if he ever saw anything weird, and he would look at me like I was crazy and said, "Dude, it's just a church. Nothing happens there." Minnesota Madness from Just Jerry. Last year we had a pretty hardcore winter where I live. I'll say it's somewhere in Minnesota. We're pretty used to driving on icy roads when we have to, but I'll just say if someone says they're comfortable doing it or even good at it, they're probably exaggerating a bit. I'm in my last year of high school, 18 years old, and I was and still am currently employed at a Jersey Mike's. Best sandwiches if you ask me. This happened during last winter on my drive to work. So it was about 4:30 p.m., and the sun was already basically useless. Technically still up, but giving off zero warmth and making everything look gray. My shift started at 5, and I'd left a little early because the roads were garbage. I'm talking that black ice situation where everything looks fine, but your car has other plans. I was driving my mom's old Subaru, which honestly handles pretty well in the snow, but I was still going about 35 on the highway because I'm not trying to die for a part-time job. The radio was playing some generic pop station, and I had long since zoned out because I drive this same route so many times. That's when I noticed a man standing on the side of the road. He wasn't walking or thumbing for a ride, he was completely still, facing the tree line. He was maybe 20 feet from the shoulder. He was so still I nearly mistook him for a statue. But as I approached, I could see the faint haze of breath coming from him in clouds. I decided to slow down, not stop, because I was curious as to what this guy was doing or what he might have been staring at. I slowed down enough to see, but not enough to make it too obvious, because then I would look like the creep. As I did, I noticed just how absolutely still he was. It was so bizarre. A person has slight sways or subtle corrections to their balance, and obviously their chest and shoulders will rise and fall as they breathe. But this guy, he was motionless. In fact, I was so bewildered by this, I didn't notice I'd completely stopped a few yards away from him. But I swear his shoulders, chest, nothing was moving. But his breath was still coming. That was the part that made my stomach sink. His breath was still coming out in those visible puffs, but his body wasn't doing anything to produce it. I sat there with my foot on the brake, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. My brain kept cycling through explanations. Perhaps he was wearing really thick layers and I couldn't see the movement. Maybe it was a prank and someone had set up a dummy with a kind of fog machine. Yeah, I know, that second one is really stupid, but I was desperate to know. The thing is, he was wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, normal clothes, not bulky at all. And then, my car chugged outside. I'm not even sure why. Did it backfire all of a sudden? Whatever it was, it caused the man to turn his head. But he didn't turn his body. His head rotated towards me, smooth and slow, while the rest of him stayed completely in place. Think that scene from The Exorcism. Something you'd hope to never see in real life. His face was very pale, and he was smiling. I don't mean a friendly smile or even a creepy grin. Just wide and weird. I hit the gas, and my tires spun on the ice before catching. I drove so quickly to work, I'm surprised I didn't slide off the road or ram into someone. Honestly, horrible of me, but I was freaked out, horrified. My mind was racing with excuses for what I just saw. The man just turned to look at me. Nothing wrong with that. The rest of what I thought I saw was an illusion. Yeah, white surroundings and his dark hoodie made me think otherwise. right? At work, I told my coworkers about the event. They seemed very into the story. I mean, not a lot happens in this town, and we are a close-knit bunch, so they weren't going to disbelieve me if I was serious. In fact, after the shift ended, one of them asked if I could drop him off along the way. This particular coworker lived along the same road as me. We did this often, actually. I'll call this coworker Jacob. Jacob had brought his car in that day, but didn't mind riding with me if I didn't, as he wanted to see if this guy would still be there. I told him he was insane, but honestly, I wanted to know too. The not knowing was eating at me. We clocked out around 9:30, and by then it was pitch black out. Minnesota winters mean the sun clocks out way before you do. We got in my mom's Subaru, and Jacob was already making jokes about it, saying stuff about how we're going to find Slender Man or whatever. I laughed, hoping quietly that it wasn't actually Slender Man. After that, he got an idea, and he scrolled through Reddit, finding Skinwalker stories to share with me. I laughed and told him to shut up, because he was actually creeping me out. As we got closer to the spot, I began to feel this heavy dread settle into my chest. Though I wanted to know what I'd seen before, I suddenly started to feel like I didn't want to see that guy again. I really didn't, but I also couldn't stop myself from slowing down as we approached for some reason. Jacob put his phone down and leaned forward, scanning the trees. "Man, there's no one here," he said. And he was right. The spot was empty. I felt relief wash over me, and I was about to speed back up when Jacob grabbed me by the arm, startling me. "Wait, stop the car." I hit the brakes. "What?" He pointed toward the trees, about 40 feet into the woods, barely visible in my headlights. But someone was standing there, watching. Same guy, same hoodie, same posture. But now he was deeper in the woods, and somehow that made it worse. Jacob whispered, "Dude, is that him?" I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up. We both sat there staring, and the figure stared back. At least I think it did. It was hard to tell. But knowing what his head could do, maybe I was wrong about that. Jacob reached for the door handle, but I grabbed his wrist so fast I probably left a bruise. "What are you doing?" I asked. He looked at me with weird excitement in his eyes. "Dude, I gotta get a closer look. See what this guy's about." I told him absolutely not, that was not the deal. He argued with me, but I began to pull away, so he didn't really have a choice. The next time we both glanced at the man, he was running straight at us. Jacob yelled, "Just go, 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 go!" I floored it, my tires spinning on some ice for a few seconds, and I thought we weren't going to make it. But thankfully, the tires took, and we finally took off. About 5 minutes later, after we were done freaking out, we started laughing. I dropped Jacob off at his house, and he made me promise to text him when I got home, and I did. Later on, we talked about it for a few hours that night, trying to figure out what we saw. He was convinced it was some local weirdo messing with people. I wanted to believe that. I really did. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Jacob. It was a photo. He had gone back alone in the middle of the night. The picture was dark and grainy, clearly taken with his phone's flash. It showed the tree line from the road. No one was there. But in the bottom corner of the image, almost out of frame, there was a hand, pale, fingers slightly curled. It was right next to his car door. I called him immediately. He didn't pick up. I drove to his house and his car was in the driveway. His parents said he was still asleep. So I went up to his room, and there he was, just fine. He gave me a good scare. He was groggy and confused, but fine. But here's where it gets really creepy. I showed him the photo on my phone, telling him that he was a psycho going out there alone to see this man again. He looked at the photo on my phone, and he said that he had no memory of taking it. He checked his camera roll, and I looked too. It wasn't there. I had no idea what was going on, and I still don't. Unemployed and nearly destroyed. From Not 3333. I know you want to hear scary work stories, but I'm in the business of unemployed, and this happened when I was actually looking for work, so I hope it counts. For context, I'm 24. I got laid off from a warehouse job about 3 months before this happened. They were downsizing, and I was one of the newer hires. It sucked, but whatever. Unemployment was covering me for a bit, and I was applying to stuff online every day. Indeed, LinkedIn, even Craigslist when I got desperate. But the place I actually found the most leads was Facebook. There are these local job groups where people post openings of sorts, and sometimes you can message business owners directly. It feels more personal than blasting your resume into the void. That's where I found this listing. Some guy named Travis posted that he needed help clearing out a storage unit. 1 day of work, $200 cash, and he would provide lunch. The post had like 15 comments from people asking if it was still available, so it seemed legit, and I thought I would be late to the party. I messaged him anyway, shooting my shot. He got back to me within an hour, and he was super friendly. He said most of the other people had flaked, and he was glad someone serious had reached out. We set it up for that Saturday. He gave me an address out near the edge of town. I live in Ohio, and there's this stretch of industrial area that's half abandoned. There are old factories and storage facilities, among other things. I didn't think anything about it. Storage units aren't usually in the nice part of town. I told my roommate where I was going, mostly because I wanted someone to know in case this guy turned out to be strange. My roommate made a joke about me getting murdered. I laughed. He laughed. It was a laughing good time. I pulled up to the address around 10 a.m. It was one of those storage places with the orange garage doors all in a row. But it looked like it hadn't been operational in years. Half the doors were rusted shut, and there was graffiti on the office building, but no cars in the lot. I checked my phone to make sure it was the right place, and it seemed to be. I texted Travis that I was there, and he replied, saying he was running 5 minutes late, and to wait for him by Unit 14. I found Unit 14 near the back of the lot. The door was already rolled up about a foot, and I could see cardboard boxes stacked up inside. That made me feel a bit better. There was actually stuff to move, so the job was real. I leaned against my car and waited. About 10 minutes later, a truck pulled in. Some beat-up old Chevy, dark blue with mud on the tires. A guy got out, and I assumed it was Travis. He looked to be in his mid-30s with an average build, wearing a t-shirt and jeans. The most normal-looking guy you could imagine. He smiled and waved at me as he walked over. "You must be Danny," he said. I told him yeah, and we shook hands. I noticed his grip was very firm, almost painfully so, but I didn't read more into it at the time. He walked over to the unit and rolled the door up the rest of the way. Inside, there were boxes, an old couch, some furniture, and a bunch of garbage bags. He told me most of it was going to the dump, but a few things needed to go to his buddy's place across town. Easy enough. We started to load up boxes into his truck. About 20 minutes in, he said he needed to grab something from the back of the unit. He walked inside and disappeared behind a stack of boxes. I kept loading until I heard him say, "Hey, can you help me with this? It's stuck." I walked into the unit. It was darker than I thought it would be. The overhead light was out, and the only light was coming from the open door behind me. I couldn't see him. "Where are you?" I asked. There was no response. I took a few more steps, but then I heard the door rolling down behind me. Surprised, I spun around and saw him standing by the entrance, pulling the door shut. I ran toward it, but he was faster. The door slammed down, and I heard a padlock click into place. Complete darkness. I couldn't see a thing. I began to bang on the door, yelling for him to let me out, but nothing happened. I then heard his voice, muffled through the metal. "Toss your wallet and your keys under the door and I'll let you out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This guy had set this whole thing up to rob me. Or worse. The job listing, the friendly messages, all of it. I told him to go screw himself. Probably not the smartest thing to say in my position, but I was panicking. He didn't respond for a while, and then I heard him walk away. I stood there in the dark, trying to figure out what to do. My phone. I still had my phone. I pulled it out, and the screen lit up the space around me. I had 1 bar of signal. I called 911 and whispered the situation as best I could. The operator said they were sending someone, but I had no idea how long that was going to take. Soon after, I heard the footsteps coming back. And I heard something else. A sloshing sound. Liquid. He began to pour something along the base of the door, and I could smell it almost immediately. Gasoline. I completely lost it. I started screaming, kicking the door, throwing my body against it, and I could hear him laughing on the other side. He said if I didn't slide my stuff under the door in the next 30 seconds, he was going to light everything up. I believed him. I got down on my knees and shoved my wallet and keys through the gap. I heard him pick them up. Then I heard his truck start. He left. He actually left. I stayed in that unit, trembling, until the cops showed up about 15 minutes later. They cut the lock and got me out. The gasoline was real. It was pulled along the front of the unit. If he had actually lit it, I wouldn't be here, and I would have died a very painful death. They luckily caught him 2 days later trying to sell my car. I wasn't his first victim, but I was the first who had called the cops in time. The others had been too embarrassed or scared to report it. Likely sketchier folk who were more desperate, or people who were on drugs, afraid to call the authorities. But one of them had told the police he had actually set a small fire before leaving, and that person got burned pretty bad. I don't look for job openings on Facebook anymore. I don't care how desperate things get. And every time I see one of those posts now, I screenshot it, and I send it to the local police tip line. Probably nothing ever comes of it, but it makes me feel like I'm doing something. I've never been more scared. From Linda. This happened a couple of years ago during a holiday rush. I was 26 and between real jobs, and I signed up to do deliveries for one of those courier companies that contracts out during peak season. The pay was more than decent, and I figured it would hold me over until January, when I had a receptionist gig lined up. I wasn't thrilled about it, but bills don't care about your career plans. The company was desperate, and I mean really desperate. They were short on drivers and even shorter on vehicles. Most of their regular fleet was already assigned, and the rentals they'd secured were going fast. By the time I got through orientation, the only thing left for me was a white minivan, a Chrysler Pacifica. Not exactly what you picture when you think of a delivery vehicle, but it had cargo space and it ran fine. The guy who handed me the keys apologized about 3 times, and I told him it was no big deal. A van is a van, and I had no idea that thing would end up saving my life. I should mention here that I live in rural Pennsylvania. There are parts of this state that feel like they have not been touched since the 1970s. My route took me through one of those areas. Long stretches of nothing and old farmhouses with long driveways, and patches of old woods all over the place that go on for miles. I can't say I loved it, but the deliveries out there paid a little extra per package. It was December 19th. I remember trying to calculate if I'd have enough saved up by Christmas to get my nephew a gaming console that he wanted. The sun sets early that time of year, and around 4:50 p.m., it was almost dark. I had 3 more stops on my list, all of them on this one road that cut through a wooded area. There wouldn't be houses for a good 5 miles. There were trees on the left, telephone poles on the right, and cracked asphalt in between. It felt like my headlights were the only lights left in the world out there. I was going maybe 40 miles per hour when I heard the pop. It was so loud and sudden, I jumped, and the van immediately started pulling hard to the right. I knew what it was before I even stopped, a flat tire. I pulled over onto the shoulder, which was mostly gravel and dead grass, and I put it in park. I sat there for a second, annoyed, before getting out to look. It was on the front passenger side, and it was completely shredded. I must have hit something on the road, but I hadn't seen a thing. I walked back a ways to see if I could find what it was, but there was nothing there. No glass or debris or anything. The tire had blown out for apparently no reason, or I just missed it. I'm not helpless though. I know how to change a tire. My dad made sure of that before I got my license. I found the spare and the jack in the back, underneath all the packages, and I started setting up. The air was very cold, around the low 20s I think, and my breath was visible in front of me. It was quiet out here, quiet enough that I was aware of my own heartbeat. No cars had passed by since I'd pulled over. I hadn't seen another vehicle in about 15 minutes. I had the van jacked up and was loosening the lug nuts when I heard a voice. It was coming from the tree line. At first, I thought I was imagining things. It was faint, and I couldn't make out words. I stopped what I was doing and just listened. But I didn't hear anything else just then, so I went back to work on the tire. Then I heard movement, branches cracking. It wasn't deep in the woods either. It was close, maybe a couple dozen feet away. I looked up again, and this time I saw something. A shape standing between 2 trees. Something very gray, too pale to be a person in normal clothes. And it wasn't standing on the ground. It was higher up, about 4 feet off the forest floor. There was nothing beneath it, not a stump or rock or fallen log. Whatever it was floating there, motionless, facing me. I froze. I couldn't bring myself to move or breathe. The shape didn't move either. We were both still. But then I heard the voice again. This time I understood the words. "Have you seen my daughter?" I don't know how I got my body to move, but I did. I turned back to the tire and started working faster than I've ever worked in my life. My hands were shaking violently. I kept dropping the wrench. The metal was freezing against my fingers. I could hear the voice repeating the question, and each time it sounded closer. I didn't look up. I couldn't. "Have you seen my daughter?" The lug nuts were off. I pulled the flat tire free and grabbed the spare. It felt heavier than it should have. Everything felt harder. I could hear footsteps now, not in the woods anymore, on the road, on the asphalt behind me, slow steps, not coming from whatever was making the whispers, but something that was answering. Each one made a soft scraping sound against the pavement. "Have you seen my daughter?" I shoved the spare onto the bolts and started tightening. My fingers were numb from the cold, and I kept on fumbling. One of the lug nuts slipped from my hand and rolled under the van. I left it. I didn't have time to go get it. The footsteps stopped then. I could feel something next to me. I could feel it the way you feel someone standing far too close to you in a line. The air got very, very cold. I could see frost forming on the side mirror. She was in the road. She was in the road, and then she wasn't. I tightened the last lug nut and yanked the jack out from under the van. The vehicle dropped hard, and I threw everything into the back, without caring where it landed. I ran to the driver's door and got in and locked it. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, and the engine started on the first try. Thank God for that rental. Before I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. She was standing in the middle of the road, right where I'd been working. I could see her clearly now, under the dim glow of the van's taillights. She was wearing a nightgown, old-fashioned. It had lace around the collar. Her hair was long and tangled and looked soaked. Her face was pale and gaunt, and her eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils. Her mouth hung open, and she was still saying it over and over. But I couldn't hear her anymore through the glass. I watched her lips move in the mirror as I drove away. I was flooring it. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway 20 minutes later. I never delivered those last 3 packages. I called the company and told them I'd gotten suddenly very sick. I never had to do that route again. Nobody questioned me. Here's the part that still haunts me. About 6 months later, I was telling this story to my aunt, and she looked stunned. She asked me exactly which road it happened on. I did my best to describe the spot. She explained that back in the 80s, a woman and her daughter were driving on that road late at night. The woman fell asleep at the wheel. The car went off the road and hit a tree. The mother survived, but her daughter didn't. They found the mother wandering the road the next morning, asking everyone she came into contact with if they'd seen her daughter. She died in a psychiatric facility 3 years later. She never accepted that her daughter was gone, and never stopped asking. My aunt lives out that way now. I go visit her with the kids a couple times a month. Every single time I drive past that stretch of road, I press the gas a little harder. My kids have asked why I speed up there. I tell them the road is bumpy, and I want to get past that spot quick. I'm not sure they believe that, but I'm not going to tell them the real reason yet. Maybe when they're older and won't get too scared to sleep. For now, it's just a bumpy road. The voice in the PA system. From Shock and Jones. I worked overnight stock at a grocery store for about 8 months. This was a few years ago when I was saving up for a trade school. The shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and most nights it was me and 2 other guys. We rotated through aisles with pallet jacks. During that time, the store was closed to customers. It was quiet except for whatever was playing through the PA system. This PA system was old. It was connected to a phone in the manager's office, but no one used it overnight. The music ran on a loop from some corporate playlist, the same 40 songs or so every night. After a while of working there, you kind of just tune it out. 3 months in, I started to notice the music would cut out around 3 a.m. Not every night, but it was often. There would be a click, followed by dead air for about 10 seconds. Then the music would come back. I thought it was some sort of glitch, or some interference. Old system, old building, and all that. But one night, the click happened, and instead of just dead air, I heard a voice. It sounded feminine, mid-sentence, like I'd tuned into a conversation already happening. And I swear what I heard was something like, "Told him it wasn't ready yet." Then silence. Then the music came back. I asked the other guys about it the next night. They hadn't heard anything like I had, so I let it go. But this happened again about 2 weeks later. A click, but then a man's voice, calm and conversational sounding. He said, "She's not going to find it there." And that was that. The music came back right after. I started paying attention to the clock. It was always somewhere between 3:10 and 3:20 a.m. Never outside that window. I told my manager, and he said the PA had been weird for years, probably picking up radio interference, like I first thought, and he didn't seem too concerned. The last time it happened, I was alone in aisle 12, stocking canned vegetables. The click came, and this time there was dead air for a while, about 30 seconds. I stopped what I was doing and listened. Then that woman's voice came back. This time she said, "He's listening again." I didn't move. Was she talking about... A man's voice responded, "I know." Then the music came back on. I was like, what the heck? I finished my shift, clocked out, and put in my 2 weeks' notice. But during those 2 weeks, I never did hear it again. I have no explanation for this. I mean, if it was interference, it shouldn't have had conversations about me listening. Or maybe that was all a coincidence. Then again, the woman's voice didn't say someone's listening. She said, "He's listening." Like they knew exactly who I was, and had been aware the whole time, and that night, they just decided to let me know. I work in HVAC now. Normal hours and no PA system ghosts. Lots of ghosties tonight, boys and gals. A gentle reminder that sometimes the scariest things we might see out there are the ones that look human, but only just enough that its subtle wrongness is pure nightmare fuel. Good night. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. You can find me on X at Dark Prevails, and on YouTube at Darkness Prevails. Send me your scariest work-related stories at eeriecast.com/submit so I can narrate them on this show. And be sure to follow and leave a review of Tales from the Break Room on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Don't forget to order a delicious bag of dead and roasted coffee over at eeriecast.store before we run out. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be back again real soon.